Joining me on Kaleidoscope Ears tonight is Dee Long from Klaatu, all the way from British Columbia. Thanks for joining us, Dee.
Oh, hello, thanks and welcome. Welcome.
It really is a privilege for me to be speaking with you because I've been a fan of Klaatu since I was about 5 years old, which is about 30 years.
That's a long time, Dwayne.
It is a long time, so I sort of know particularly the first three albums inside out. Now, can you give us a little bit of a background on how you and John Woolischuk, the founders of the band, found yourselves making music together? You were working together in an electronics factory at first, weren't you?
Well, yes, that's how we started the band. Originally, I met John Woolischuk and Terry Draper when I answered an ad in the paper for a guitar player. They were starting a new band, and they needed a guitar player, and they called the band Mud Cow, which has got to be one of the worst names anybody's ever come up with for a band. And we spent a year together working on original songs and doing cover songs. We played a few gigs, and we weren't all that great. It wasn't a great band. Also, Jamie Bridgman was playing organ. Great player. Everybody were good musicians, but somehow the band just didn't work very well. So we went our separate ways, and then John Woolischuk and I started working for my father at an electronics company, sitting next to each other, soldering circuit boards on an assembly line for not very much money an hour. And one day John came in and he had a sheet of names of bands, a piece of paper with the various band names on them. He said he'd spoken to this chap, Terry Brown, who ran Toronto Sound, and John had gone in looking for a job as a tape operator, and he'd shown Terry some of his lyrics, and Terry said, well, why don't we just record some of these songs? Oh, he also gave him a job as a tape operator as well. So John came to work and said, we need to start a band. Do you want to join the band? And if so, what name should we pick? And we looked at the list, and Klaatu leapt out at us because that was, we were both Sci-fi fans, and Klaatu is from the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still, and it was the perfect name, and we went from there. It was just the two of us at first.
Now, your first single was called Heinous of Uranus. Now, the title changed for the album version when that was released. What was the story around that?
Well, that's the old story that I wrote the song, and I called it Anus of Uranus, and I was a young lad, and I thought it was funny. And we recorded the song. It was the first song we actually recorded. We hired a drummer, and we did this song, and when we went to make a single out of it, the record company said, we can't call this Anus of Uranus. Nobody's going to buy it with that name on the cover. So it was Terry Brown came up with the idea of adding the H and calling it Heinous of Uranus, because if you listen to me sing the lyrics, you really can't tell if I'm saying heinous or
no, you can't. Okay, all right. Let's. I've got the Sunset album, which was released a few years ago by Bullseye Records in Canada, and that's a collection of rarities, and it's actually got the original single version of Heinous of Uranus, so let's listen to that now. You're with Dwayne on Kaleidoscope Ears. This is Edge Radio 99.3. We're talking with Dee Long of Klaatu, and we just heard a couple of other rare tracks as well from the Sunset album, Dr. Marvelo and Cherry, or Sherry, is it, Dee?
Sherry, yeah.
Sherry. Now, actually, that song didn't make it on until the third album, I believe. That was a very early demo, that one. Now, what's the story behind Terry Draper? He was the third member of Klaatu. How was he drafted into the group?
Well, like I said, we had played together in a band. The first two recording sessions were Heinous of Uranus and Sub Rosa Subway, and in both cases we hired a drummer in. And then after that, John just brought Terry in to say hi, and I knew him as a good drummer, and I don't know, we never really sat down and made a plan for him to join. It just, we said, well, you're going to play on this track, and he did, and from then on we just continued on as the three of us. Terry's an extremely creative guy, and he was very much a part of what made Klaatu special, I think, in that him and Ted Jones would spend a lot of time working on the album covers, working on the details. We had the Daily Sun fan letter and things like that. That was mostly Terry and some John doing that stuff, and I was busy trying to get heavier sounds out of my guitar while they were busy doing the really creative stuff.
A lot of your music contains science fiction elements. You're mentioning before you're all fans. I don't think Terry Draper was an exception either. And you mentioned that the name comes from the day the Earth stood still. Were there any other particular sci-fi inspirations that you drew from?
Well, of course, my big one was Star Trek, the original Star Trek especially. I remember us rehearsing one day, and there was a Star Trek on, and I had to stop to watch it. It's like, and I got a lot of ribbing from the other guys about that. But they were big fans too. As I've said many times before, when I'm asked what kind of TV or film I like, I always say anything with spaceships. It's my line for it covers most of it.
Was there any call for you to write any music for the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still?
Well, yes, we wanted to get them to use our songs or to get us to write something. That would have been great, and we approached them. Actually, I think a total of 3 times we spoke to somebody representing us, spoke to the people at Fox who were making this movie, and each time they politely just dismissed us, saying that this was going to be a score-driven movie. They didn't want any pop music in it. Our publisher, Pure Music in Canada, made quite a lot of effort, and Frank Davies also got involved and contacted somebody he knew who worked on the set, and all of that was to no avail. They haven't used any of our music in it. We had quite a few fans sign petitions on the web, that sort of thing. But from what I hear of the new movie, it's kind of an action movie. It's a typical Fox Films vehicle, and doesn't really bear all that much similarity to the original movie. Similar to the way I, Robot didn't have anything to do with the book. It just took the title. I believe that they really wanted something that would appeal to the young kids, and they didn't want to involve any pop music, and certainly not pop music that was around in the 70s, so that never happened, and it's a shame. I think it would have been great, even just to have, Anus of Uranus playing on a radio in the background while somebody was doing something else, just for the fans to have a little touch. But
they could have done that at least, yes.
I would think so.
Yeah. Now, I was having a look at your website over the last couple of days, and you've got a couple of references there which seem to me to be like to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You're a fan of that one as well?
Oh, that's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the original radio show and the original BBC TV series are a couple of my favorite stories of all times. Douglas Adams, I was just a big fan of his. Yeah,
there's a little picture of you on the website underneath a quote from Zaphod Beeblebrox's Doctor, I think. He's just this guy,
Yeah. And I liked the recent remake too. It wasn't the same, but it was good. I quite enjoyed that. I think the story is so fantastic. And there was a trilogy or more of books with the guy that had the universe in a box on his desktop and all that. That's right up my alley. That's the kind of stuff I really love.
Well, speaking of British, regular Kaleidoscope Ears listeners would know how much of a big Doctor Who fan I am. What about you?
Yeah, Doctor Who, the original series, again, I really loved it. I found it a little cheesy, a little silly, but it was very early days when they did that, and I really loved the music that was done on the big BBC synthesizer that took up a whole room. I thought that was wonderful.
Yeah, it was pretty cutting edge.
Yeah, at the time, boy, talk about cutting edge. Yeah, the new one does hold some of that. As the music for the new one is really well done, take on the old version. And I've seen a few shows that I liked.
Now, getting back to the music, the Mellotron in Calling Occupants, I was listening to that the other day. It reminded me a lot of some of the early King Crimson sound. What bands were inspiring you guys in those days musically?
Well, certainly King Crimson was a big one for me. I used to play their stuff on my 8-track tape player and my Volkswagen Beetle all the time. And certainly Moody Blues as well, and they were big on the Mellotron, and the Beatles used the Mellotron on a few things. It was definitely a unique and fabulous sound for its day, back before we had samplers. And, the Knights in White Satin, that sort of thing, they had the biggest Mellotron on the planet. I think it had 3 keyboards on it, and we had our own Mellotron, and I was the Mellotron repairman. I had to keep it going. And if you know anything about them, you know that they don't take to moving around or to lugging them on the road very well, and they don't like anybody looking at them sideways where they break down. They're very fragile devices. And I used to have the basement full of worn out Mellotron springs with tapes dangling from the ceiling and stuff, and I was the guy who kept ours going. But nowadays you can do all the same thing with a plug-in for a couple $100.
Well, speaking of Calling Occupants, let's have a listen to that one now. You're with Dwayne on Kaleidoscope Ears, and we're speaking with Dee Long of Klaatu. We also heard a couple of other rare tracks from the Sunset album just then, Little Neutrino and True Life Hero. True Life Hero was actually my favourite track off the album for a long time, Dee. I realised recently that you wrote that one. Little Neutrino scared the willies out of me as a kid. It was particularly the album version with the, being a Doctor Who fan, the voice modulation sounded like a Cyberman or something like that. So I was very frightened by that track, but being able to listen to the lyrics and take in what it's all about these days, I don't get quite so nervous as I used to. Now, why did you guys want to remain anonymous as a band? On the first album, there's absolutely no mention of lyrics, or I think in the Canadian release, there was not even any song titles on the cover.
Yeah, I believe that's true. We didn't want to put any names on the cover. We didn't want to go the typical route of having to tour, having to put ourselves up front, having to dress up like rock stars, which we didn't think we were. We really wanted the music to stand on its own, and we really wanted to just be able to make music and have people enjoy it and hopefully make enough money to make more music. That was all we ever really wanted out of what we started to do. And we felt that if we tried to dress ourselves up and do shows and, put on the back of the album that John likes fast French fries and fast cars or something like that. We used to be the old classic. That just didn't seem like that was us. So we decided to go without any names, without any pictures. And even when we signed our record deal with Capitol US, they didn't have our names either. We signed through a lawyer who did it on our behalf. And all of our songwriting credits were registered under pseudonyms, so that we wouldn't have to expose ourselves to the regular this craziness of being a rock star. We didn't want any part of that.
Now, something interesting happened because of that anonymity. Tell us about the Beatles rumour. What's that about? How did it start? How did it affect the band?
Well, it was the first album had sat in the delete bin it was in the delete bin after 9 months of being released, so obviously it hadn't done all that well. And this Steve Smith from Rhode Island, New York, wrote an article in a newspaper. It's the only article he ever got published as well. And I spoke to him a few years ago at the Klaatu convention, 2005, and so it was ironic that the only article he ever actually got published caused such a fuss. But in the article, he claimed that this album, the Klaatu album, the first one, was the Beatles reformed. He figured that the sun on the cover, the face on the sun, was a merge of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and he had dozens of other little clues, reasons why this could be the Beatles reformed. Of course, Sub Rosa Subway sounds a lot like the Beatles. There's a few songs that do. And this came out in the U.S. in a small paper and got picked up and around the world, really, mostly in Europe, Australia, Brazil, and in Canada and the U.S., and it was on all the papers, and suddenly our album started to sell, and of course Capitol did not have enough in the stores. They had given up on it, so they had to press them, and over the next few weeks they sold about 1 million copies. They probably would have sold 2 or 3 million had they had enough of them available. They had people lining up down the street to pick them up, and we were in England recording our second album. And when we came back, the secretary at Toronto Sound handed us a stack a couple of feet high of photocopied newspaper articles and magazine articles showing that we were definitely the Beatles, including someone from Australia who'd done a voice test on Sub Rosa Subway to conclusively prove that it was Paul McCartney singing. So it was a very strange experience, and we sold a lot of records, but whether it helped our career or not, certainly if our album had remained in the delete bin, nobody would have ever known about us, and we wouldn't be talking now. So it probably did help, at least in the initial stages.
And what was your personal response to that? Did it fuel the ego, or was it embarrassing for you?
Well, it wasn't embarrassing at all, and I guess it did fuel the ego. I mean, I remember thinking, well, this is great. People are obviously liking the music. If they think it could possibly be the Beatles, what higher compliment could you possibly get? But it didn't make us want to come out and show our faces for the same reasons as we didn't want to in the first place. So Capitol in the States took out some ads in Rolling Stone and such, just saying that Klaatu is Klaatu. And in any interviews, Frank Davies or anybody associated would say that Klaatu is not the Beatles. This is not the Beatles. They said this over and over again, but at that point people didn't really want to hear it. And when they finally, somebody looked up in the Library of Records in the U.S. and found the pseudonyms and found our real names and where we lived and realized it was three guys from Toronto, the whole thing sort of tapered off, and I think people got a little upset that they felt they had been hoodwinked or fooled by us, although we had no intention to do that. And I personally always felt that the music we were making was good enough that one way or the other people would hear it and would like it, even at the point where we were working on our second album. The first one had obviously not gone anywhere. I was still convinced that it would happen, and when it did, I just thought, well, this isn't the way I expected it to happen, but this is kind of cool.
You were also noticed by other big names in the music business. The Carpenters was probably the most obvious one. They did a hugely successful cover of Calling Occupants only a year or so after the album came out. Tell us about that. What's the story behind it?
Well, we received a letter from the Carpenters at Toronto Sound saying simply, "We've been observing your band." And apparently they had heard the first album and they were big fans. They really liked the music. So they did that cover of Calling Occupants, and the album they were working on, they wanted to do 2 or 3 more Klaatu songs, but the record company said, no, we have enough for this album. So let's move on, and they never did. And from what I understand, they were going to do one of my songs. So it would have been nice had they done so. The song Calling Occupants was written by John and Terry, and it was the sales of that particular single probably eclipsed everything else that Klaatu did, and probably the royalties also eclipsed anything else we did, simply because of who they were. And I thought they did a pretty good job. I was a real big fan of her voice. I thought she had one of the all-time great voices.
Absolutely. Now, I was also reading that during the recording of the first album, you had a encounter with Mick Jagger. Is that right?
Actually, that's true, yeah. We were working on Little Neutrino. It was 3 o'clock in the morning at Toronto Sound, and the bell went off at the back door, and I went out to get it. And I opened the door, and there was this short guy standing there who looked a bit like Mick Jagger. He said, could I come in and see the studio? And I said, no, I'm sorry, we're closed right now. Maybe if you can come back tomorrow or make an appointment. And just at that point, the second engineer came around the corner and saved me from making a fool of myself and invited Mick Jagger in. He was a lot shorter than I expected him to be. And after a few minutes, I realized this must be the real deal. And he came in and he stood at the back of the room, the control room, and what we were doing at the time was Steve Vaughn, the second engineer, was running the tape machine. I was turning the very speed, and we had Little Neutrino on the 24-track machine backwards, running backwards, so all you heard was this loopy-loopy noise. And Terry Draper was out doing cymbal rolls while I did a very speed of the whole track up and down, swooping, and we were recording backward cymbal rolls with the pitch going all over the place. And Mick Jagger just stood there and looked at the speakers for a good hour, probably half an hour to an hour. He stood and listened to what we were doing, and none of it made any sense, and yet he didn't question any of it. He looked at the gear and he walked around, and then he thanked us all for our patience and letting him check out the place and left. And to this day I wonder what the heck he thought we were doing.
And now, with the second album, Hope, I've read that you weren't overly happy with the album and the direction it was going in, being a concept album. You were more interested in pop. Is that correct? And what direction were you wanting to take the band in at that time?
Well, personally, I was hoping to take the band to expand on what we'd started. The first album had a lot of individual songs that were radio friendly and were all quite different. I mean, from song to song, you would jump from Sub Rosa Subway to True Life Hero. They're very different vibes and characteristics to the songs. And I wanted to continue down that route. And then I got a call from John Wallace-Chuck one day saying that he had written the entire second album and I should come in and we'll rehearse it, which didn't sit well with me either because I kind of wanted to have a song or two on there of my own. And he had exactly done that. He'd written an entire concept album that was all orchestrated. And song to song, I felt if you didn't like the entire thing, there would be no part of it you would like, because they're all part of the same song. In other words, he had written an opera or a musical rather than an album, and that was a cool thing to do, but it wasn't the way I saw us doing our second album, and I thought it was a big mistake. So I took off and wrote two of probably the most radio-unfriendly songs ever, was Around the Universe in 80 Days and The Madman.
Well, I've got those on the Sunset album queued up now, so let's listen to those and we'll come back to you. You're listening to Kaleidoscope Ears on Edge Radio 99.3 with Dwayne, and we're talking with Dee Long of Klaatu, and we just heard the two tracks that you penned for the Hope album, Around the Universe and in 80 Days and Madman. Now, tell me, how did you and John Wallace-Chuck work together as writers? Did you do anything together?
Well, we never did collaborate on writing. I'm not very good at collaborating, although John is. He's collaborated with quite a few different writers, including Terry Draper. The only time we actually did end up collaborating on a song together was with the song Silly Boys, where we took the original Heinous of Uranus 2-inch 20, actually I think it was a 16-track tape, and we flipped it over upside down, and we recorded some new tracks along with some of the backward stuff that was on that tape, and we came up with the song Silly Boys. Of course, we had a backwards vocal going through the whole thing that was actually Heinous of Uranus backwards, and John Wallace-Chuck took home the tape and sat down and listened to it and wrote out what he thought those lyrics backwards were saying in English. And then I went back into the studio later with a very expensive vocoder and recorded some of those lines forward, and some of them you hear from the original vocal backward. And of course, because John wrote the lyrics, he gets the lyric credit and I get the music credit. So that's the only time we ever collaborated together. And I'm not a good collaborator. I like to do things my own way, and if somebody says, let's try it like this, I say no,
But Silly Boys did work really well, I've got to say. Now, by the time Cerami Suit was released, but your writing styles, yours and John's, seemed very different. His seemed more psychedelic. Yours seemed to be more rock-oriented. How did you work, even though you weren't collaborating, how did you work together with those dynamics?
Well, not a lot. We actually... my songs on that album, Terry Draper and I recorded the bed tracks on our own while John Wallace-Chuck was busy with another project, and Terry Brown was working with Rush. And we had a very good record contract with Capitol, and they gave us lots of money to record the third album as well. And so Terry Draper and I went into Sounds Interchange for a couple of months and just messed around and started doing stuff. At which time we got to meet Ozzy Osbourne, who Mr. Manson is his favorite song ever, he kept saying. But what happened after that was John came in and played some of the parts, and Terry Brown came in and we re-recorded a few things, and we merged it together, and then we moved to Terry Brown's house with a remote studio, a studio in the back of a large truck, a mobile studio, I guess you'd say. And we recorded the rest of the stuff there, including Routine Day. The sound of the rain at the beginning is a sprinkler on Terry's swimming pool, and we had the drums in the living room, and we worked together, but we were going in different directions. We all felt we wanted to do an album full of singles again, of radio play material, because, as I had pointed out, Hope, a lot of people loved Hope, and it did fairly well, but it didn't get a lot of radio play because, like I said before, it was too much the same thing over and over, and we wanted something that was different. And I wanted to get into more heavier rock. Mr. Manson's a good example, and John was going off into Tokimore Fields, so it's like... I don't know. We all went separate ways. Terry Brown also was not happy with the direction we were going in, and I was not happy with the mixes, and John was not happy with the strange sound effects in the middle of Mr. Manson, and we all sort of finished the album the way it came out, and we went our separate ways for a while because we were just musically going in different directions, no question about it.
Even though you were doing that, I still think the album came together really well. And it's good to be talking to you, because my favourite tracks off that album are Older and Mr. Manson, which were written by yourself. So thank you for those. Well, let's have a listen to a couple of tracks from the Sunset album, but during the recording of Cerami Suit. We'll listen to those now. You're with Dwayne on Kaleidoscope Ears, Edge Radio 99.3. We're talking with Dee Long of Klaatu. And Dee, we listened in that mix to a live version of Older. How did you like performing live?
Well, I've always enjoyed performing live, and I know we started out not to go that direction, but we realized by the time we did I guess our fifth album with Capital Canada, we needed to do something to get it restarted. People were not picking up on it, and we weren't getting much radio play. Capital Canada said, okay, we'll pay for a tour across Canada where we opened for the band Prism. And I really enjoyed it because we hired some friends for drums, bass, and keyboards so that the three of us could focus on standing out front and just doing the parts that we really wanted to focus on and not having to do all of the overdubs and go crazy trying to fill in the tracks. After all, three people doing Sub Rosa Subway would be pretty tough, especially back then. But, the tour itself across Canada was wonderful. And we would open up for Prism, and people would go crazy, and they'd hold up signs, and the flash bulbs would go off, and then we'd leave the stage, and most of the audience would go home, and Prism would end up playing to an almost empty hall. And after that, they broke up. They realized that maybe they weren't as popular as they thought they were, because they really stole the show. But after that tour, it started to go, where do we go now? We did get offers to go to the States, to Los Angeles, I believe, and Chicago, to do big gigs, and nobody would pay for us to go. We didn't have the cash, and record company wouldn't pay, even though we would have gotten paid had we done the show. So they just said no, and we started playing the bars and the high schools and universities in Ontario and in Quebec, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I didn't want to be playing bars for the rest of my life. It was not a lot of fun. And so I left the band, and they hired a guitar player to take my place, and I had the unique experience of going to a club in Toronto and listening to Klaatu play Venus of Uranus while I danced with Lisa Del Bello, a famous Canadian singer who's about a foot taller than me. We danced to my song being played by this guy I didn't even know, but it was a very strange experience, and I got tired of playing live, but had we stuck to the real tours that we did well, that was great, and the audience loved it, and I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed singing songs like Older, because you can let loose in a song like that.
Absolutely. Now, that was a bit later on in the band's history. Prior to that, you moved to California to record Endangered Species, the fourth album. It's probably the least regarded of all five of Klaatu's albums.
Yeah.
What led to the move to California to do that?
Well, Rupert Perry was running Capitol Records at the time, and he invited us in to talk about doing a new album. We didn't have it in our contract, but they were willing to go for one more album if we could, come up with something that would get some radio play. He's on the album saying "pedal yourself" over the phone. It's exactly what he said. You've got to pedal yourself. I'm having a hard time with that word this morning. But, we had to follow their rules. We had to go to Los Angeles. We had to pick a producer. We picked Chris Bond from a few that came by. Main reason we picked him was because he appeared to know all about our stuff. He was very knowledgeable about the albums and that. And, as we learned later, he had studied up the day before and never heard of us before. But and the album was kind of lazily played by his friends who he hired at triple scale to play drums and bass, and he, choreographed the entire album, played most of the guitar, and then we would come in and sing our parts and play a few guitar parts here and there. So that album was really the least us of all of the albums, and I personally think it's the least exciting, and it didn't do very well. Rupert Perry left the company just after it was released, and the guy who took over from him decided to scrap the album. They pulled it from the shelves of the stores as we were driving down the street, and we heard it playing on one of the LA radio stations, one of the songs. I think it was I Can't Help It, one of my songs, playing on the LA radio station, just as they had told us they were pulling all the albums out of the stores. So that one again didn't do so well.
Wow. I mean, I have to agree with you. It just doesn't have that same Klaatu feel about it that the previous albums had. Even though by the third album you were going different directions musically, it just didn't have that same feel. But what was the general response in the public to Endangered Species? Do you think they were, by that stage, feeling a bit ripped off that you weren't the Beatles?
Well, certainly that had come to haunt us. Each album sold a little less than the one before it, without exception, right to the final one. Actually, probably, Magenta Lane, the final fifth one, was only released in Canada, so obviously it couldn't sell that many. But over the years, through Bullseye Records, bullseyecanada.com, they still sell our stuff. That album's done fairly well, and Dave Bradley, who runs the Klaatu.org website, that's his favorite album, and that's how he got to know Klaatu. So it has, and it's also, much to my distaste, I Can't Help It is the one song of mine that's made me more in royalties than any other song.
Wow.
And the version on the album, if you could hear the original demo, or maybe you have, I don't remember, is it on the Sunset? It blows away the final recording that they spent so much money on. They spent $150,000 US recording that album, and my demo blew away the version they came up with. So, and it was done on a 4-track. So
well,
there you go.
On that note, let's have a listen to it right now. You're with Dwayne on Kaleidoscope Ears, Edge Radio 99.3. We just heard Dog Star by Klaatu, and we're speaking with Dee Long of the band from Canada. Now, those were a couple of tracks from the fourth album. You stayed together to release a final fifth album called Magenta Lane. Why did you do that?
Well, we didn't want to end on a sour note. We all felt that Endangered Species hadn't come out as well as we'd hoped. I mean, when we were actually hearing the final monitor mixes, it sounded pretty good, but I think they lost it in the final mixes, and we wanted another chance to do something that was completely us. We went to Capital Canada, and they agreed to pay for it. Of course, we didn't have near the budget we did before, but John Jones and myself started a studio called EST, Extrasensory Productions, in a little town of Buttonville, north of Toronto. And we needed to buy some gear, and Klaatu needed a lot of studio time for not much money, so we made a deal where Klaatu bought, I think we bought 4 months worth of studio time up front, and we used that money to buy the equipment to start the studio. So it helped us all out. And it meant that the three of us, and we hired a few musicians to do strings and that sort of thing, but mostly the three of us recorded that album the way we wanted to record it. I did have one of my friends play drums and bass on a few songs, which did bother John and Terry a little bit. But other than that, it was a Klaatu album, and we wanted to end on something that was at least us. If we're going to be down for what we've done, we want it to be for something that we actually did. And I like that album a lot. It probably didn't achieve the potential it could have had, but there are some moments on that album that I really, really like. And I'm quite proud of it. And it was nice to go out at least doing something that we did ourselves.
Yeah, it is a fantastic album. What have you been doing since leaving the band?
Well, I've been doing many things, such as after we closed the EST studios, John Jones and I went to London, England to work at George Martin's studio, Air Studios there. And I worked with many acts from Paul McCartney, Duran Duran, Dire Straits, quite a few people. Got to be good friends with George Martin and John Burgess, who owned Air Studios at the time, when we had Studio 5 there for quite a few years. We had a Fairlight Series 3, and we did a lot of production. I did production with Eric Clapton on the movies they did with I forget the name of it. I did a few movies that he played on, that sort of thing. It was a lot of fun. And then it started to not go anywhere, and they were moving the studio. They had to the lease was up on their building at Oxford Circus. So I decided to move. I ended up coming back to Canada. I didn't decide to move. I actually came back to do, Klaatu was going to do a few of my songs on a compilation album. It was going to be some extra material for a compilation album. It was a little record company in Toronto wanted to do this. And I got back, and the record company went broke. And they were supposed to pay my flight back, and I hadn't prepared anything, and I could have gone back, but I thought, I'm just going to stay here. All my friends are here. I know everybody in the business here, and it was fun. I was in England for about 7 years and worked with I did over 40 McDonald's commercials, and I worked with dozens and dozens of top artists, and I was getting a little tired of staying up till 3 in the morning with the speakers blaring. I was getting a little older, and I wanted to come back to Toronto. So I moved back to Toronto, and I started to learn how to do computer programming, which I got into for a few years, and I've been doing web design ever since, and I've done a few solo CDs in my home studio, which has been a lot of fun, as well as a DVD that I spent almost 3 years making a DVD using green screen at home with standard consumer quality gear, and actually won an award for the video for outside, and that's done me fairly well over the years. Now I do a lot of web design, and I have a little 3-person band in Lillooet that we play all the old favorites, and we do a few Klaatu songs and a few of my songs, and having a lot of fun and enjoying my getting older. Somebody suggested I write the song younger, and maybe I could turn it around to make it a sequel, but I haven't done that yet.
You said you met Paul McCartney, which I believe was a dream of yours to meet one of the Beatles, which happened. What did he have to say about you, the rumours that were happening in the mid-'70s?
Well, it's a good story. I came to Air Studios one day, and the guard at the gate said, "I have a note for you from Paul McCartney," and he hands me a note that says, "I'm going to do you," signed Paul McCartney. And then he smiled and laughed and said, "Don't worry, do you just means he's going to beat the crap out of you, but other than that, it's okay." And he told me the story. The guard told me that, let's see, Paul had been on a talk show, and they played him a little clip from Calling Occupants and said, "Is this you singing? Do you know who this band is?" And he said, "I've never heard this before in my life," which I guess was true. And then he came back to the studio one day at Air Studios and asked George Martin, "Who is this band Klaatu?" And he explained that, somebody thought they were the Beatles years ago, and one of the chaps happens to work in Studio 5. His name's Dee Long. Why don't you go say hello? And so he came in that day, and he came in, I was in Studio 5, and he walked in with 2 big burly bodyguards with pinstripe suits behind him, and he had a black eye. And we chatted for a half hour, an hour at least. I'm not sure exactly, but we chatted for quite a while just about music in general. And he said, "So I hear you were in a Beatles clone band." And I said, "No, we were not a Beatles clone band, although we did sound a lot like the Beatles at times just because we were big fans." And I explained, that, and he could understand that totally, seeing as they started out copying Carl Perkins and other American country players, so he could understand that one no problem. And I asked him about the black eye, and he said he got it from one of his kids rolling around in bed, but I wonder if that was the truth. He was very nice, very pleasant, and I got to talk to him several times after that. He actually came and jammed in Studio 5 one day, and I got to do some sound effects for a movie he was doing, Rupert the Bear, and hang out with Paul and George Martin. And I found out that Studio 5 used to be his smoking room, and the Beatles used to play or record at Air Studios, and a lot of the gear we were using, the Fairchild 2 compressors that we were using, they had used back when they were recording there. So it was kind of cool to be working with the same equipment that they used to create those classic songs, classic recordings.
That's awesome. Now, you mentioned before you've released a few solo albums. I was looking at some of the videos which are available on your website, deelong.com,
right.
From the Outside album. Fantastic videos and fantastic music as well. You were using a program that you created called the D-Sampler for the drums. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, when I moved to Lillooet from Vancouver, my wife and I, Sydney and I, moved to Vancouver, from Vancouver to Lillooet. I had just gotten some money to record a new record from Bullseye Records, and so I had everything I needed. I could play the guitar, and I can sing, and I can play the keyboards, but I didn't have a drummer. I didn't know anybody here, and keeping a drummer in your band is one of the most difficult things to do in life, period. So I realized I needed a drummer, and so I'd spent a lot of time working with hip-hop artists in Britain and watching how they work, and they would combine drum loops, and they would put them all onto a 24-track side by side, and then they would sit and play the loops with the faders and build a new drum track that could sometimes sound surprisingly real. And I decided to make a piece of software for Windows that would let me do exactly that. And it allows you to take drum loops that you can purchase or you can create yourself. It'll actually create them from scratch if you want, and then you can synchronize them together so that even different drum loops and different players can be merged in a way that it sounds like it's all one performance. And if you listen to the drums on Outside, and especially on Welcome to the Future, my latest CD, there's a lot of songs where you would never ever notice that there wasn't a real drummer, and it's all entirely done by me on my little computer and then the software sells for $20 on my website, and it's getting a little long in the tooth. It still works. It'll only work with Windows XP. It won't work with Vista, and I don't have the time or the energy really to update it or upgrade it, but I use it all the time. I use it live on stage. I also use it for triggering videos. When I'm live on stage, you can use MIDI commands to trigger video and project them behind you, and it was very useful for doing the DVD and for doing my albums. I could not have done any of that stuff without it, so it was a lot of fun. And it's nice to be a programmer, because when you've got your own software and you, for example, there's a video on my DVD of me sitting in my studio on Mars answering questions from an interviewer, and the interviewer is me asking myself questions. So I set it up. I added a feature to the D sampler where I could I asked all my questions, spread them out on MIDI commands, and then I sat and answered the questions. And after I'd answered the question, I'd kick a foot pedal, and it would ask me the next question. So because I'm a programmer, I can make my own software do whatever I want, and I had a way to do whatever I wanted, and it was a lot of fun. So, it's also, there's a free version on my website which does everything the other version does, except you can't have as many sounds loaded at once. So anybody who's got Windows XP and wants to have some fun, it's a lot of fun.
Excellent. So still making music and enjoying life, and so it's been a pleasure to be able to speak with you, Dee, and a real privilege. So thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome. I had a great time. Thanks, Brian.